Fischler, how are you today?
Hopeful that I don't blow it.
Oh my goodness. Michael, thank you for joining us today, for being part of the retirees interviews that have been taking place for the last year or so. I'm going to have a group of questions. You can pass on any of them and you can talk for as long as you want, but if I put my hand up, that means how many seconds you've got left to go.
Okay.
We're on our way. We're on our
Okay.
way. Please state your formal name for the audience today.
Michael Lauren Fischler,
Where were you born, Mike?
Malden, Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm. Prior to coming to Plymouth, what kind of professional experiences did you have? Were you at another university before you came here?
It's part of the story, the evolution of how I got here. The probably, if I go back to growing up and graduating from Newton North High School, and getting admitted only to like 2 universities. I think it was Northeastern and the University of Miami. I chose Miami to sort of have the Don Johnson life, the Miami Vice life, to drink, carouse with women as much as I possibly could, and get some sort of, during that day, Miami was considered a marginal institution. You know, it was a place I thought I could have fun and maybe get a degree, but the degree was least important. And after 2 years of failing and carousing with women, not really getting into the alcohol or drug scene, it wasn't part of my identity, I ran into Ren Bentolila at a party. It was a religious party that she had sent her, she was sent to sort of learn how to speak English. I found her very attractive. I had one advantage with her that I didn't have with other women. She couldn't speak English, so she didn't understand anything about me. She later shared that she would agree with everything that I said because essentially she didn't have to explain anything because she could hardly talk. And I assumed that she was really in love with me and attracted to me. So that evolved. I was a marginal student at Miami. Excuse the length of these stories, but I don't know how else to explain it. I was a marginal student in Miami, and I got my first B in my 4th semester. I was on probation continuously, and it happened to be in a social science course. I discovered education. They had a major called in education human relations, and I got a degree from Miami in social studies education. The interesting component is that my GPA was 2.21, and it wasn't high enough for the 2.25 that they required to student teach. So they had to have a special meeting to allow me to student teach along with the other losers in the program. I had requested that they place me in Coral Gables High School, which was the most elite. I had a MG convertible. I saw myself as sort of being a really cool teacher, and they did let me student teach, but they sent me to an all-black school in Richmond Heights. And that was the beginning of the evolution of my life that I had no idea. I was with this middle school with all these black kids. I was teaching 3 sections of English that I was never prepared to teach, in 1 section of social studies and English combined. And then, as fate would have it, on April 4th, Martin Luther King was assassinated. My teacher who took care of me, Mrs. Lodeholt, a black woman who I loved, when I came into the school, she was in the room where you sign in, and she couldn't teach, and she handed me her notes, and she said, "Mike, can you take over?" And I said, "Of course." And I sat with the students thinking that I would be attacked. These were all black students. There was de facto segregation in those days. They literally had a wall that the black community lived behind and whites on the other side in this part of South Miami. To make that long story short, the kids, no one attacked me. They were really disinterested. I started the lesson, which was reading "Oh Captain, My Captain" that Mrs. Lodeholt had left for me, and nobody really participated until the section I had before lunch. And that one section, which was my highest track, the multiple tracked school, that one section of individuals interacted. And I asked them the question, why are we here? Why am I reading you this poem? Because Martin Luther King was killed last night. And then I asked, who killed Martin Luther King? And someone said, the white people. And here's this white person speaking to them. And then I said, well, tell me, what is a white person? And I went to the board and wrote the word white person, and they gave me all the white person. People have all the opportunities. White people don't like black people. And I'm thinking, I'm this white person. And another individual says, white people are cheap. And then another one said, not all white people are cheap, just Jews. And I realized I'm Jewish on top of being a white person. And I wrote up the word Jew as a category. I said, so what's a Jew? Jews are cheap. Through every stereotype you can imagine. Jews abuse black people. They take advantage of black people. And then the bell rings, and I asked them if they would hold their seats. And I said, I want you to know that I'm a Jew, and I'm a white person, obviously. And if you think of what was in the mind of the man who assassinated Martin Luther King, maybe it's in your minds. You did the same thing to white people and Jews that you might accuse, this bigoted individual of doing to you. Just look at the blackboard. And within an hour, I was greeted by a teacher, a science teacher, who came over and essentially was rabid with anger in regard to, she said, the students left your class upset. They talked about Jews. I'm a Jew, she said, and they were talking about being disturbed by your lesson. What did you do to these students? And I had taken a course in one of my education courses, said that if you get into trouble at all, write down who, what, when, where, and how. And I did. And my supervising teacher, Jim Wells, who happened to be the director of the student teaching program, the person who came out to evaluate me, I told him I was in trouble, and he asked me to explain the story. And he said it was remarkable what happened. I said, remarkable? He said, would you write it up? I went home, I told my father, and my father helped me to write a narrative. They submitted it to the Miami Herald, to the Parade magazine. They ran it as a story. And here is the story. This is this thing that and it shows over here. This is exactly.
Can you read the title for us?
It says April 5th, today's topic, current affairs, white, Negro, Jews, and the teacher. And then the narrative on the story, and Mark Fischler and Nicole and Valerie and Rodney had this framed, and it's been hanging in my house.
And that was the beginning.
There would be no Plymouth State University without that.
Thank you. Amazing story, amazing story. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Well, it went on a little bit more, just that Dr. Wells asked me to stand to like 300 people who had student taught. And he said, Mike Fischler, who wrote this article, is reflective of the excellence that we have in this program. And I'm thinking, holy shit, you're the person who supported me. You weren't even going to let me student teach. You know, you had to have an exceptional, I'm reflective of. And I took the accolades and I was walking out. I had one more course to take. I had to take Math 100 for the third time that summer to get my degree. And this African American comes up to me as I'm exiting the room. And they had offered me a job at Richmond Heights because of this experience where I was at one of the few social studies jobs that was available in Miami at the time. And this African American male came up to me and said, would you like to get a master's degree? I said, I haven't even graduated from school. I'm getting married. I can't afford to, I don't think I can get into a master's program. He said, don't worry about it. He said, we'll take care of that. We have a fellow, it was called a Male Elementary Teachers Fellowship. You'll get certified in elementary education and we'll pay you to go to school. And I was paid to go to school. I got my master's degree, and then I was admitted to the doctoral program at the University of Colorado. You asked the question, have you been at another university? I supervised student teachers at the University of Colorado for 1 year. Ren got pregnant with Mark. I guess I contributed toward that. I needed to get a job. I had applied to, I figure we're living in Colorado. I went to school in Miami. Where would I like to live? California would be one place. In New Hampshire, where to me all the rich people went to go skiing. So I looked and I found Plymouth State, and I figure any school, I'd never heard of it before, that I never heard of, Plymouth State, may be willing to take me without my doctorate. And the other one in California was Chico State, that I thought was named after one of the Marx brothers. And at any rate, I applied. Plymouth State never got back to me until June. I got a call asking if I wanted to be interviewed. I had struck out this famous individual, even though I thought that people would be knocking down my door to hire me. Plymouth State was willing to interview me. My parents paid. Ren was 7 or 8 months pregnant. My parents paid Ren's way, figuring that their son would probably blow the interview. Let her be there, because Ren is charming and people like her. I brought her with me to the interview with John Foley. And John Foley, this wonderful, loving, fatherly figure, saw Ren pregnant and wanted, I don't even remember being interviewed. I remember him and his love for family, and wanted her here. And then I could come along for the ride and get a job as a professor. That's how I got to Plymouth State.
Who was the president at the time?
Harold Hyde.
Thank you, thank you. All right, and what year did you come?
I came in 1970.
1970. When did you retire, Michael? Can you do that?
Retirement, yes, exactly. 2017.
2017. Think about everything that happened from here to there. It's amazing, and you just started.
And for people who might be interested, there was a roast in 2017. If you go to YouTube, Mike's Roast or something, and it is a literal roast with Dick Hage being the MC and people kicking the crap out of me. it's really entertaining, so anyone who might want to see it, see if you can find it.
Oh, that would be fun. That would be fun. People gathering to celebrate what you have accomplished here as a person, as a teacher, and far more, far more. Okay, thank you, thank you. What a beginning. I don't know what to say. When you came here in 1970, what was the status of our today's university? Was it Plymouth Teachers College? Was it Plymouth State College?
It was Plymouth State College.
Thank you, thank
Right.
you. You can pass on this one. Do you remember the first year's salary?
I have a story with everything, but it was $8,200. And I was grateful to get the job, any job. My parents thought, my son, the professor, suddenly I felt like from being a loser, academically, I was a professor, Fischler. And my father, who was a businessman in Boston, I never knew how much money he made. They didn't consider it polite to talk about money. So I had no idea what other professors were making. It was my first year. And I went down to a place you may remember, Donnie Jock's. He had a gas station next to Plymouth Furniture Company. I pulled in there and Donnie came out, if you know Donnie. And he said, "Hey, Mr. Fischler, you guys over there at the college make so much money, huh?" I said, well, how do you know how much money we make? And Donnie said, "It's all in the Manchester Union Leader." And the first thing that came to my mind was, all the salaries are in there? He said, all. And he said, "Would you like to see it, Mike?" I said, "No." And I felt like this is none of my business. My father raised me this way. And I started driving out, and then I couldn't leave. And I went back to his little room. And I said, "Do you mind if I see that newspaper?" And then I took a look, and they start sequentially with the top salaries at the top, and I went through the front page, and then it said connected, on page 15 or something. So I turned to page 15, and then everyone was listed on page 15, except a couple of people. It said on the very back page, I was the second lowest paid individual at the university. I was in round G, sharing an office with a business professor who actually was paid somewhat less than $8,200. And that was the beginning of my awareness that I was at the bottom of the totem pole when it came to being significant human beings, well paid at Plymouth State.
Could you live on $8,200?
Barely,
Barely.
And having a baby. But back then you could do it, and the inflation is incredible. The gynecologist ended up not taking money for the delivery of the baby. I mean, we had one blessing after another.
You are so fortunate. There are good people in this world. There are good people in this world.
And I ran into many of them, and many of them were connected to this university.
I love it. When you came here in 70, the population here was rampant. It was growing. It was growing. And did you see that in your classes? Let's go backwards first. You've been hired. What are you hired to teach? What were the courses and the responsibilities that you had?
It was elementary ed, it was methods, and it was supervising student teachers. And I remember, like it was yesterday, the first day of class, my coming in, and I was 24 years old, and my students, I'm sure, were 22. I had more in common with my students, and probably I still feel that way, than I necessarily had with my colleagues. And I remember being terrified, not terrified, but just anxious over, could I pull this thing off? And it was easy. It flowed. And when I left the class, I remember thinking I would pay them to let me have this job. I felt like the most blessed person on earth, and it never changed.
In all these years.
I've been blessed to be able to have that relationship with my students.
Mm-hmm.
and help if I could do my job effectively, help to change their lives.
So you taught in the classroom for so many years, you supervised student teachers. As the years evolved, what other things were you on committees on campus? If so, what would they be?
Well, I think the interesting part, I was on tons of committees on campus, but the interesting part was probably when it came to my doctoral dissertation, my studies, I started off thinking I was going to be an administrator. It ended up going into my dissertation was dealing with addictions and psychological counseling. So I evolved to that other discipline, and I had spent some of my time studying at Yale in their Drug Dependency Institute. And my dissertation was focusing on an instrument that they were utilizing in evaluating change in behavior. And to make a long story short, that introduction to psychological counseling became even much more meaningful in 1974 when I had completed my doctorate. And there was, you have a 12 credit hour load per semester, but they could only fill 9 of those 12. And Norton Bagley, I think, came over and asked me, would you be willing to start a counseling center? There was no psychological counseling. And in Memorial Building, where I had my office, we began the Psychological Counseling Center. Darlene Brill, God rest her soul. You would never have this today. And Jim Smith. Jim Smith was my boss in student affairs. And they made appointments through Darlene Brill. I remember Bob Tuvison was an individual who did his internship with me. But to make that long story short, that was the birth of the Psychological Counseling Center. And it happened because they needed to fill in part of a load. And by the time I left the counseling center, 40 years later, they had named the center after me. That's, an incredible honor. I love my staff, and we developed a model in which individuals who taught in the counselor ed and school psychology program, which was my last department that I was in officially, we tried to, for the individuals who were teaching psychological counseling, we tried to give them an opportunity to work and learn from practicing their art, like I did. And so there was always that interface, and that was the model where individuals who taught theory would learn more about what it's like to have a client by treating clients.
We need that practical application.
It was part of the identity of the center at the time, and something that taught me more about having relationship and working clinically with individuals, which informed my teaching and made me a better professor.
As you think back, who are some of the people that influenced you when you were first here and maybe along the way as well? If you don't mind mentioning some names. When you first came here, was there somebody that supported you? And as the years went on? And you've mentioned Darlene Brill, Jim Smith, Bob Tuvison.
I was very much a civil rights sort of activist, and I mentioned when we started the counseling center, I noticed there was no GBLTQ support whatsoever on campus. There were no books in the library, and that was going to end. And so I think we had our first GLBTQ meeting of individuals, a support group, which included faculty and students, and I've got stories relative to that. But the evolution of the center, when we talk about individuals who were there to help me at the beginning of my career, of course Jim Smith was instrumental, and his family was instrumental we became a part of their extended family. The place really was a place that was a lot like family. Norton Bagley saved my ass. For example, during my maybe second year, my students in my elementary methods course, I had them read a report that was written in regard to poverty in the state of New Hampshire. You don't have to go down south to find poverty, or in other parts that there was tons of poverty here. I had my students read it. Thanksgiving was coming up. In a Mike Fischler style, I asked them what they'd like to do about it, and they said they would like to sort of complain. I said, why don't we write a letter to the governor? I will send the letters in a package to the governor of the state of New Hampshire, which was it wasn't Peterson, it was Meldrum Thompson, I believe at the time. So Meldrum Thompson got a folder filled with letters from my students. I remember one of my beloved students, who I'm very close to today, said, I hope you choke on your turkey. The governor got upset with this guy, Mike Fischler, like, who the hell is he? And as I remember it, called and complained to the president and Norton, and the president said, what's going on with Mike Fischler? And I was counseled by Norton Bagley, and I remember that there was some discussion about should we fire him, and Norton Bagley protected me. Otherwise, I'm not sure. If maybe Harold protected me as well. But the point is that there have been people throughout my career who have been there to back me up so I could have this interview today.
And I was so glad that they backed you up so you could be with us. When you came to Plymouth, what was it about Plymouth State that excited you? Why did you decide? Was it just a job? Or was it more to it than just the job here in the White Mountains?
Wren, who had the smallest city Wren had ever lived in, was Boulder, Colorado. And when she came here, it was like all the movies she had seen about American life. And she immediately felt comfortable. She was worried because the baby would be born in a month. So we rented an apartment, which is above Hong Kong Garden. I think it's called the Chinese restaurant downtown. They had an apartment on the top floor because she wanted to be able to get to the hospital. We became close friends with Brian and Jean Johnson, who was the gynecologist, and who wouldn't take a dime in regard to the delivery of the child. I mean, it went in the small town where we lived close to the hospital, became safer and safer. Eventually, we had an apartment in the sticks on Tenny Mountain Highway, in Fairgrounds Farm, I think it's called. And then eventually we got the money together, loans from my father, to be able to build the home that we live in, we have never moved from, in Holderness. Our life here has been one of blessing after blessing, difficult situations certainly, but I've taught my students, that when there's a crisis in your life, there's an opportunity in your life. You can grow. And so any of those crises have been opportunities for growth that ultimately have been blessings.
Michael, if I asked you, with all the years you've been on this campus, what your major contribution was to this campus, to our students, what might it be? Please don't be humble, please.
My major contribution.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we had this situation and that evolved, and with one of my graduate students who I loved, who I was asked to write a letter of support. She was being charged with having an inappropriate relationship with a student. You know the case I'm talking about. And Christy, 10 years earlier, had been my graduate assistant and had done an exemplary job. And I wrote a letter in support of her, and all hell broke loose. And without going into any more detail in regard to individuals being targeted, a sense of fury and abuse, and the institution being targeted, if you will. And ultimately, that caught me and two of my colleagues up in this issue at Plymouth State University. The name was taken down from the counseling center.
Your name was taken down.
Right, as part of the, if you will, the response of the university. And when we finally reached a settlement agreement a year later, what was really funny is that in 2017 I retired. We had the roast in 2017. In 2018, in July of 2018, about a year later, suddenly this explosion took place. And I was dealing again with what for me was civil rights issues, freedom of speech issues. So for 1 year I was in conflict with the university, and instead of retiring, I felt like I was teaching another class. I couldn't retire. And when the litigation ended and we reached a settlement agreement, there is a stone that is outside the counseling center. I don't know if you've ever seen it,
I have.
but on the stone, if you asked what is the positive part of taking the name off the center, which is not a positive experience, or was not a positive experience. But Don had come up with, he had reached out to me. I was very angry at the institution, but he called me and said I remember his words, he said, "Mike, this may be hard for you to believe, but this is bothering me more than it's bothering you. I'd like to try to find a way to build a bridge." And we went out and we had a lunch together, and that began a reparative healing process between him and myself, which eventually came up with the settlement agreement after a year of conflict with the university. And then Don had come up with this idea for a stone. He said that every time he leaves his home, he walks past the Frost house, and there is a marker there, if you will, in regard to, the home of Robert Frost. He thought maybe we could have a stone put outside the counseling center with a plaque on it, sort of reflecting on Dr. Michael Fischler, Professor Fischler, began the counseling center in 1974, and he was its director till blank. And I saw that as a wonderful opportunity to have more of a statement, and Don never flinched. And I said, I would like a statement to reflect my philosophy and what this institution has meant to me and what I have tried, in the years that I've been here, to mean to the institution. And so if I read you the plaque statement that's on the plaque,
Would you
I
please?
think that summarizes best the answer to your question. It says on the plaque, historical site of the PSU Counseling and Human Relations Center, founded by Professor Michael L. Fischler in 1974, and inspired by the lessons he taught during his 50 years of teaching. The center stood devoted to reducing human suffering, providing safe and supportive resources to PSU's diverse student populations, and in the spirit of ut prosim, act as an advocate for creating a more mindful and compassionate campus community, and through its graduates, a wiser and more humane world.
Could you ask for anything more?
I figured
Yeah.
it's my last word.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And
May I ask who wrote that? Did Don Warden write it? Did you write it?
I wrote it
Mhm.
with the help of another person who's been a wonderful mentor and very close friend of mine, James Miller. You know James, who's like a brother.
Mhm.
So I wrote it, leaned on James. Don Burks liked it, contributed, edited, put his heart into it, and ultimately approved it. We kept jokingly asking for a bigger and bigger rock because Fischler couldn't keep his friggin' mouth shut. And I felt that it needed to be said.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate sharing that with the audience that we have today. If we had a group of people here that had applied for a position at Plymouth, and you had an opportunity to talk to them, what might you share with them because of your wisdom, your years at this university, 50 years? What would you say to them? They may have other authors, we don't know that.
It seems like the institution itself is incredibly diverse, and whatever department you're applying to get into is a culture unto itself, and it probably always has been that way. There's a great deal of diversity when it comes to and a lot of it probably dependent on the people who were in positions of leadership in the department and the culture of the discipline. I would say, I think that Maslow's hierarchy of needs that every education course teaches 19 times or something like that. It's always brought up. And it starts off with the lowest level need that has to be fulfilled, physiological fulfillment. Then it goes up to safety and security, love and belongingness, and so on, and self-actualization at the top. And I would argue that he missed the point, that the most powerful need that human beings have is to have meaning in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have meaning through, Freud said, the major areas in life are to love and to work. And to have meaning in love, which can be very precarious, as we know, and very difficult, but then to have meaning in work. And what I would say is what's really important is that you use this opportunity to primarily benefit others through finding meaning in your work and in your life. And if this doesn't work for you, or if that finding meaning through evolving the identities and helping individuals, your students, to find meaning in their lives through whatever your discipline is teaching, if you're not committed to that, I'd recommend you go somewhere else. And if you are committed to it and you can add to the culture of this community, then I would encourage you to be here, and I'll do anything I can to support your getting here.
The type of student that we receive today at 18 and 19 years old, it is so difficult on them today to walk into our university, a college, and know exactly what they want to do for the rest of their lives, for fulfillment. Our job really is to say just what you said. If you don't have the passion, then we will help you move into an area so that work doesn't feel like work.
Right?
Yeah.
Well said.
Wow. Yeah.
And I think that it's never been any different. I think that I started off as a business major, and I ended up being a counselor, directing a counseling center, and being a teacher, and finding it meaningful. If you asked me in my first year at Miami what the hell I wanted to do, I would have no clue. But it's through the evolution of life and what life brings you that I did not create. what was brought to me,
Mhm.
maybe by a higher power, someone who knew more than me, but these situations have all been instructive in regard to defining my identity and what gives me meaning and what my purpose is on earth.
A lot of us have asked that question of ourselves over time, and we grow by searching for the answers to that. Yeah. Our time has almost come to a stop, so I'm asking you, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience about your time at Plymouth? It's obviously you have loved what you have done here over the course of 5 decades. Is there something else that you would like to share with our audience before we say goodbye?
For me, it's nothing but gratitude for the blessings that have been bestowed upon me, much more than I deserve. Through my family, you know, Mark is teaching here, and Mark's chair of the department. Through what the community has offered my wife, my children. Valerie and Rodney live in Holderness, and Mark and Nicole live in Thornton. They're close by, and that's not an accident. So for all these blessings, the university has been central in my life. Love and work and love has been central in my life. I'm grateful.
Michael, thank you. It comes from the heart.